Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Philip Yan, CEO and President of World Affairs, and I wanted to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today and welcoming you to our program. The program's entitled, just to make sure you know you're at the right place, How Will the Global Economy Be Different After COVID-19? I'm honored, and my job is very easy to get out of here as quickly as possible, but I'm honored to introduce our panel today for today's program. We have Gillian Tett, Editorial Board Chair and Editor-at-Large at the Financial Times, and she is, I believe, in New York. We have Mohamed El-Erian, Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz. He is in Southern California. And James Manyika, Senior Partner at McKinsey & Company and the Chair of and Director of the McKinsey Global Institute. So welcome to you all. We're so happy that you are able to be with us to talk about this important topic that is on everyone's mind. And as I said, I'm done. And so Gillian, I'm going to hand it off to you to start the conversation. Again, thank you all for being with us.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Philip. And we do indeed live in extraordinary times. As you just heard, I'm speaking from New York, where for the last few days, I've had protesters keeping us awake at night, literally outside our window as an expression of the social tumult that's currently sweeping America. And we have, of course, James and Mohamed speaking remotely from very different places as well. But we're all united in looking at this extraordinary time in the global economy and feeling both pretty scared and alarmed, but also maybe seeing some crumbs of optimism. And that is what we are going to talk about today. Mohamed and James have each, from different perspectives, been looking at the question of whether the global economy for a very long time. So I should start by asking, when you look at the situation of the global economy today, how bad is it compared to, say, 2008? Is it better or worse? Let me start with you, Mohamed, because you were really in the middle of it back then, weren't you?
So I think it's worse because the lasting effects will be more. And let me explain. The global financial crisis was like a heart attack. It hits very hard. It paralyzes everything, but it's localized in the heart. And if you can get to it pretty quickly, you can restore normal functioning. And how do you get to solve a financial crisis? Well, financial crisis is about counterparty risk. People don't trust each other. And if a central bank is credible and come in and says, trust me, I will come in between you, then you restore the system. It doesn't mean it's necessarily get back quickly to where you were, but you do get back. This is different. Think of this as infections in every part of your body. That's what an economic lockdown does. It causes that multiple damage. And in order to get better, you need to have synchronized improvements in the body. Otherwise, one part will pull you down. We see this in the United States today, where certain states are having to lock down again, and that's disrupting the flow of people across states. So this is harder to overcome, and I suspect that the effects are going to be much more lasting.
James, would you agree?
I would agree, but also add that in some ways this is different because we're dealing really with two very different phenomena. On the one hand, we have a public health crisis, which is devastating, and we don't know exactly how it will work out because between the rates of infections, the disease we're trying to understand, the solutions to it, whether it's the vaccines or the therapies or treatments, that's all an unfolding story with a fair amount of uncertainty, at least in its timing. So you've got that going on, and then you've got the economic implications. And I think what makes this quite different, in addition to what Mohamed just described, is that these two things have to kind of work together and they affect each other. So if we're going to think about reopening the economy, we not only need to think about economic measures to do that, but we're also having to think about public health safety for how we can do that safely. And it also raises the question, Gillian, about how do we think about the effectiveness of our policy tools on the economic front when those tools were built for situations where it was all about the economy and not really to do with a public health crisis. So it's one thing to give people checks and stimulus, but if people can't actually go out there and participate in the economy, that may not be as effective. So the combination of these two factors, both with their own uncertainties, also makes us quite remarkably different.
I must say I find that fascinating. I mean, I'm actually trained, although I've been working for years at the Financial Times covering finance and economics. I'm actually trained originally as a cultural anthropologist, and I did a PhD in that originally. And one of the things that anthropologists always say is that economics had far too narrow a lens of how you define the economy. Do you think that the current crisis really is the first time that economists and economic policymakers have been forced to actually widen their lens properly and realize that the economy is not just about economic statistics?
Absolutely. And in fact, it's even wider than that. So, I'm always fascinated when people ask, how is the economy doing? And people typically are answering that from different perspectives. Some are talking about the stock market, some are talking about GDP, some are talking about jobs, and some are talking about incomes. But now we're also talking about health. So in a conversation about the economy, we now have to include everything. And for you, Gillian, as a cultural anthropologist, questions about human behavior, human confidence absolutely play into how we think about the economy and society. So in some ways, this is back to perhaps Adam Smith's original conception of how we ought to think about the economy in a way that encompasses everything, actually.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, Mohamed, you're actually the incoming head of Queen's College in Cambridge. In fact, my old alma mater, as it happens, which is a place that has been trying to take a slightly wider lens of economics in recent years. Do you think there's going to be a change in how economists look at their own role going forward?
So I want to make a distinction between mainstream economics and economics. For mainstream economics, which is very narrow, neoclassical, lives in cyclical space, modern structural space, this is a surprise. I came across this in the 80s when I was working at the IMF and I was working on Sudan. And when you work on a fragile or failed state, you see exactly what James referred to. If you do not know whether you're going to be safe walking in the street, or if you do not know if your shop is going to be looted if you take the shutters up, you don't participate in the economy. So development economists have seen this before. Behavioral economists have seen this before. What we're needing to do here, and I'm really impressed by how quickly this is happening, is bring in the health aspects. And economists that are multidisciplinary in nature are doing this really well. The high priests of neoclassical economics are struggling.
You make a great point there, because when I first started as a financial journalist working the markets, I was told that there was EM and DM on the trading desks, emerging markets, developed markets. And they basically rocked to entirely different rhythms. And the presumption was that the kind of skills you needed for EM, emerging markets, you didn't apply to the developed markets, the grown-up places like America. Do you think we're actually moving to a world where, in fact, it's all blurring, and that political risk, medical uncertainty, issues of psychology and social cohesion are affecting developed markets as much as developing ones or emerging ones?
So let me tell you a story. I remember 2009 talking to a US policymaker and suggesting that there were insights to be gained from looking at developing countries. And I was told that was wrong because advanced economies live in cyclical space and developing countries live in structural space. And as it turned out, the global financial crisis was the leading indicator of structural problems, structural impediments, as we found out later, because we couldn't grow inclusively. I think there's a lot of lessons, and the neat division that we had is no longer there. And it's especially no longer there because we are seeing the official sector having to intervene in the functioning of markets in ways that are very familiar to the developing world, but were pretty unfamiliar to the advanced economies. So there are a lot of insights to be drawn as to what to do and what not to do from the experience of developing countries.
I mean, it's one way of putting it. So, kind of, James, is that basically we thought that these kind of problems would be like getting a cold, and you'd kind of get a cold periodically and then you recover. But actually, you're waking up and realizing that actually it's more of a cancer. Something's actually quite fundamentally structurally wrong. James.
I think it's actually quite structural. And in fact, and it's wonderful to hear you recall that distinction between, I think you both made it between economies that are cyclical and economies that have structural challenges. Well, advanced economies have had structural challenges. If you look at the last 20 years in the advanced economies, which is something we've just done recently, and you look at the structure of those economies, while of course a lot has gone well, but a whole bunch of things have structurally not gone that well. Think about inequality. Think about the advancement of all the places in those countries. It's quite striking that even before this COVID moment, everyone was celebrating job growth in the United States. Well, that was a very localized phenomenon. If you had looked across the United States and went from place to place, you would find a few things. Much of that job recovery was in a few places, several counties. We had this fun exercise of looking at all 3,000 counties across America. It's actually 3,000, I think 149, I now know the number. And if you looked at, as you looked across those, something like the job growth that we were celebrating happened in about a third of the country. There was a middle third that where not a whole bunch happened, it was mostly flat. And then there was another third where, quite frankly, there were still job declines. So these structural questions about inequality or inequities of people and place are actually quite structural. We've seen this across much of the advanced economies. These are not cyclical questions at all. These are structural challenges. And I think those have been quite exposed. And in this COVID moment, we see them in much starker reality. I'm struck by the fact that if you take workers, for example, right now in economies like the United States, and Europe is not dissimilar in this regard, something like about a third of the workers are actually vulnerable. This is vulnerable either to layoffs, furloughs, reduced hours, and so forth. And if you look at that, roughly a third of those employees, which is about 58 million in America, the majority of them are low-income workers who earn less than $40,000 a year. A disproportionate number of them are people of color, Black and brown people. The majority of them of those vulnerable workers don't actually have college educations. And those are structural challenges. So I think we're now having to rethink a lot of these structural challenges, which quite frankly start to look a lot like some of the structural challenges in developed markets. So these distinctions, to Mohamed's point, between the developed and the developing are not as real as we've made them out to be in the last 2 decades or so.
And the irony, Gillian, if I can just say, because I agree so much with what James said, the irony is, think of what was the mantra guiding the policy response in 2008-9, because that was an important political moment to get things done. And these political windows closed, as we found out by 2010 with the emergence of the Tea Party. It was the 3 T's, that policy should be timely, agreed, targeted, agreed, and temporary. And that is the cyclical mindset, is when you think that the intervention is like someone going into a doctor's office and they get fixed and go back out, as opposed to someone who ended up in the ICU. And when they come out of the ICU, there's still a major rehabilitation process to be done. And when you have the amount of inequality, not just of wealth and income, but of opportunity, every time you get hit with a crisis like that, it sets you back years.
So if you take these points one by one, I mean, let's start off, say, with the inequality point. Do you have any confidence that we're going to see measures to reverse this rising inequality anytime soon? Or are we going to be sitting here in a year's time or 2 years' time with inequality even worse in America than it currently is?
I'm actually optimistic because if something has happened in the last few years, call it the last 2 or 3 years, but even more importantly in this COVID moment, is I think an appreciation and realization that in fact our economies have to be inclusive, and in some ways business has actually been, in some ways at the forefront of this to a large extent. You have to look at, for example, the declarations by the Business Roundtable. I think, many CEOs, it's just been quite striking to see how the mood has changed between what you might call shareholder primacy and at least some expressions of wanting to take a much more expansive view as to what that is. So I think now we still have to see what comes out of that, but the fact that we are even having that conversation, I think is an important change. Now, real action still has to come out of that. We still have to think about how do we actually do that? How do we make sure the equality of opportunity is widely available? How do we make sure that people can actually get access to jobs and access to training and education? The real work can now begin. But at least the fact that we're now talking about it quite explicitly, I think is an important signal.
What do you think, Mohamed?
So like James, I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm cautiously optimistic because one of the silver linings of this crisis was getting us close to what I call the Sputnik Moment. And for those of you who are too young to remember the 50s, the Sputnik Moment for the US was when the Soviet Union, the USSR, what later got called the evil empire by Ronald Reagan, sent up a satellite successfully, and the US woke up to the threat of something coming from out of space and destroying the US. And there was a moment where people came together and achieved something that lasted a very long time, which is US superiority in space. I'm hopeful that we're getting closer to the Sputnik Moment. It's been building, and I think the combination of inequality and injustice have come together. But I'm not completely optimistic because I don't expect this to be a top-down process. If you're hoping for a top-down process, it's not going to happen. This has got to be bottom-up. It really has got to come from the grassroots and develop into a lasting movement. So companies have gotten it because their employees care. And the employees have put enormous pressure on companies to be more socially responsible. I don't think governments quite get it as yet. So it's going to have to be a sustained movement. But I think we're closer to the Sputnik Moment than we've been for a long time.
That's a great point to make. I should say, by the way, that if anyone who's watching wants to ask a question, please do go ahead with the Q&A function on the screen. And we would love to bring in some of your questions into the discussion as we proceed. But I should say that I think you make a great point there, Mohamed, because again, when I think about what's happened in the last 6 months and compare it to 2008, there are two things that leap out at me. One is that the CEOs this time round do appear to be sprouting a social conscience in a way that they absolutely were not in 2008 for the most part. And you can sit there and say, well, this is just about their own survival and they're concerned about sort of pitchforks at the gate, but certainly the mood in the C-suite's changed. And the other thing that I'm very struck by is the degree to which millennials and younger people, and Mohamed and I both got teenagers about the same age, are absolutely engaged. And to my shame, my daughter, through her social media posts, has been learning about the news on average about a day or two ahead of me because they're all busy talking to each other as teenagers. And she is red hot engaged in a way that I wasn't at her age, and I don't think that many teenagers were back in 2008. Either of you guys got any thoughts about that?
Well, what I think one of the things that is the case, I think this is going to be one of the big challenges in the 21st century for companies that want to lead in the 21st century. They're going to have to deal with the fact that consumers, and in fact, especially younger consumers, care about these issues, whether it's these social questions, or whether it's the environmental climate change questions. They're having to pay attention to these. And in many cases, these young people, whether they're teenagers or college or at work, now have a voice. they get to organize, they get to engage, they get to speak, and they find their ways into working for these companies. And in those companies, they have a voice. So quite often, and it's quite interesting to see whether, I suspect part of the response we're seeing from business is in part driven by that. But I think it's also in part driven by the fact that they're starting to see the reality around them. I mean, look at the range of issues, whether it's the social questions, the environmental questions, but even questions around the 21st century companies are going to have to deal with, like, how do we deal with the use of technology in our systems, in our economies, in our business, whether it's everything from privacy or the role of platforms and these questions. These have become real questions that companies in the 21st century are having to now really think about.
Mohamed, as a fellow teenage parent.
I'm ahead of you, the two of you, by the way. My son is 20, and believe me, he's talking a lot about these issues.
So it doesn't get any easier.
No, it gets louder.
Gillian, if you and I were to talk about James' son, we would conclude very quickly that we are really bad parents. So let's not go there. Look, I think everything James said is right. I think companies genuinely realize you can't be a good house in a bad neighborhood, that you've got to care about the neighborhood. But I think there's something else that I know that you're very aware of, Gillian, is that there's a level of embarrassment, because within weeks of this crisis, while the unemployment rate was shooting up, while more than 30 million Americans had lost their jobs at that point, companies were raising money left, right, and center at very low rates. Wall Street had disconnected from Main Street. And that's because the policy response was very effective when it came to the financial side. And it is companies and rich investors that benefit from these asset markets. It's not the person in the street. So there's also part of an embarrassment that companies, the big companies, and owners of financial assets are doing so much better than the rest of the world. And there's a fear that comes with that, which is, you said it once, the pitchfork, will they come? So I think that as much as there's a positive, there's also a less charitable element going on here.
Absolutely. Well, if I look at two other, we're getting some great questions, by the way, so I'll turn to those in just a moment, but if we look at some of the other big themes that have been exposed by COVID, one has been this issue of inequality and the fact that there is a recognition that people are going to have to create safety valves, if nothing else, and hopefully ways to address it. Another big theme, though, has been exposed, which is a point that Mohamed made, which is about markets. America is founded on this free market ideal, small government ideal in recent years. And yet the reality is we now have financial markets which are so utterly dependent on the central bank that, frankly, it's very hard to argue that prices are being set in some sectors by anything other than the central bank. We have the government increasingly getting involved in all kinds of spheres. Is America still a free market economy? And do you expect the next few years, as we come out of COVID, to be about rolling back the power of the market and maybe having more government intervention? Who would like to take that?
Well, I'm happy to start. I think we are going to see the role of government in the economy increase, if only for two reasons. One is the need to inject, whether it's stimulus or liquidity, or quite frankly, help support businesses and enterprises and participation in the economy. So you've got that part of the role of government. You've also got the other one, which in some ways is government as the safety net. I mean, look at what's happening right now with benefits that are going to individuals, whether it's the unemployment insurance or the different mechanisms in which government is having to support people. And it's also quite interesting that the role of the government is supporting people while, it might have seemed quaint. And in fact, it's quite striking to me that, a year ago or two, the idea of universal basic income was kind of a quaint idea. Not to say it's going to come to pass, but it doesn't look so quaint anymore. because in effect, that's what we're doing. And we may need to do that for a lot longer, depending on how long this takes to recover from this. So the need to support people, the need perhaps even to support and help coordinate our health response, I think, is necessitating a much larger role for government. I think it would have been quite interesting, by the way, if, to have debated the questions of healthcare now as opposed to 6 months ago. It would have been quite interesting what the perspectives and the public response would have been when those topics were kind of being debated in the political economy. I think we might even have had quite different outcomes to that debate. So I think we are going to see the government much, much more involved. Now, the question is, what's the right way to do that? What's the arena in which government should be involved? I think that's the debate we should have and think about it. By the way, the idea of small government has been a mirage for a very long time, as we all know, if you actually look at the numbers, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mohamed, you've written a lot about central banks. Is there any chance of us having normal financial markets anytime within our lifetimes?
No. As the Fed will find out pretty quickly, and as the ECB has found out with negative interest rate, this is a no exit paradigm. Once you get in, it's actually very difficult to exit, because not only do you make the markets dependent on you, but you entitle the markets. So whenever you're thinking of getting out, you risk having a major market tantrum, which will make you worry about financial volatility contaminating the real economy. So the tendency is, once in, it's very hard to exit. Look, the scale and scope is remarkable. Just let me give you, we are in what I think is round 2 of a multi-round process, which is what this is. And the multi-round involves multiple rounds of living with COVID, that we find a way of balancing reopenings with the health side, as James said. And then there's the post-COVID. And it's the lots of rounds here. In round 2 so far, if you put the government and the central bank together, it's over 30% of GDP of basically private sector activities that have been taken over by the government. 30% of GDP.
Wow.
And then if you look at how it's been done, it's a spaghetti bowl. There have been no principle that are leading this. So you try tonight untangling a spaghetti bowl. It is very difficult, because you pull one thing, you then end up pulling something else you don't really want to pull. So this is gonna be with us. I think we should learn that phase 1 of a crisis is you never make the best the enemy of the good, because you have to intervene quickly. But what good crisis managers do is they learn quickly, and they course correct. And we have an opportunity to start course correcting. Otherwise, we're going to continue adding to the spaghetti bowl that's going to take away the magic of a market-based system.
Yeah, I must say I was very struck by just reading that wonderful story about the fact that $1.4 billion worth of checks have gone to people who are dead through the Employment Insurance Protection Program. And in one level, that's understandable, but that's a lot of money to be then trying to recoup from all over the country, $1.5 billion worth. And it shows, the challenges that policymakers face as they try and live with a world where best was not they weren't trying for perfection, they're trying for rapid response. But
well, I was going to say, Gillian, one of the things that's also been fascinating, and it'd be interesting to see what the long-standing, long-term implications of this will be, have been kind of the phenomenal, essentially global experiments that we've been doing in this moment. So think about what's happened to the acceleration of digitization, and the role of digital infrastructure and digitally enabled things in our economy is gone. We've gone from 0 to 60, if you use a car analogy, overnight. I mean, yes, e-commerce was already a feature of the economy, but boy, has it expanded. We've talked for decades about ideas of working from home and remote learning. We went from nothing to one big global experiment, if you like, on working from home and remote learning. We're all parents. We've seen that movie and how we've been trying to help our kids and, grown-up young people to learn remotely. It's been remarkable. Now, I think, and then, we seem to be kind of moving into this, I'll call it a, low contact or no contact economy. I think it's going to be quite interesting to see how many of these trends stick and how many of them actually revert back. And these have profound implications on how the shape and nature of the economy will look. I spend a lot of time with companies right now who are scratching their heads about their real estate footprints. Are they going to keep these large campuses? Is everybody going to come back to work? Will people want to come back to work? How many want to come back to work? How do they deal with this hybrid structure? The other day, I was spending time with a set of CEOs who run hospital systems. And, they've gone from maybe, remote telehealth being and consultations being, 8-10% of the consultations that they do, to now they've been almost 80-90%. Now, will it stay that way? Of course not. But is it going to go back to the 8-10% that it was? Probably not. So I think the shape of how our economy looks in these very real, tangible ways are going to be quite different.
And James, I must say this because you guys have done such great work on it. We are seeing a level of dispersion, of divergence, that is scary. So while we could have gone from 0 to 60, certain people went from 0 to 100 and other people went from 0 to 10. And let me give you an example in the US and an example internationally. I sit on my daughter's board for her school. And what they have noticed is a huge range of dispersion in grades. Yeah. And those are correlated to socioeconomic conditions. And it's not hard to see why. If you are from a challenged segment of the population, you may not have the Wi-Fi you need. You may not even have a room in which you can work. So we are seeing nationally this acceleration. People press fast forward on some pretty important trends, but not everybody was ready on that. Go globally, and we are going to see the derailment of a number of developing countries. They cannot cope. We can talk about striking a balance between health and the economy, between lives and livelihood. Zimbabwe entered this crisis with 5 ventilators, 5. South Sudan, 3. This is serious. We are going to see, unfortunately, this as being the great unequalizer if we're not careful. And that, again, is not predestined. Policy can change this, but this is what will happen if we're not careful.
Those are very thought-provoking, James, and I'm going to go to questions.
Yeah, I was going to say the dispersion that Mohamed describes plays out almost at every level. You see it in the business arena as well. If you look at, in this moment, how our business is doing, there are a set of them who call them either the digital infrastructure providers or the highly digitally enabled businesses. And they are doing phenomenally well. In fact, the question is how much have they grown in this moment, partly because they're prepared to operate in that environment. You've got at the other end of the spectrum, businesses where at the end of the day, they have to be in a physical place. The workers actually have to show up in a physical place. And the consumers for those businesses have to show up in a physical place. And if you're one of those businesses, it's awful. Nothing is going on. So think about the hospitality industry, think about the travel industry, think about places where people have to show up. And so those differences were already there across businesses, but they've been widened in this moment. Do
you think there's any chance, before we just turn to questions quickly, James, is there any chance that when the controls lift, we may almost see a sudden backlash against digital and everyone saying, you know what, I'm totally zoomed out. I want to basically do a whole bunch of slow living, real experiences, etc., etc. Do you think that might be what happen, or do you think that's just a bit naive or a bit hopeful?
I think some of that is happening. In fact, it's interesting. We're watching all these surveys and consumer sentiment data that's coming in for different segments of society and in different countries. There's a fair amount of that where people are looking for real experiences and are craving real experiences in real places. And the travel industry is actually one example of that, where people looking for nearby stays, looking to go somewhere close by where they drive as opposed to fly. Doing these small scale things is actually growing in interest. But at the same time, I think people have come to appreciate that digital infrastructure may actually be much more foundational than perhaps we thought. And in fact, we all need to build kind of digital resilience and preparedness. Think about what has been one of the core infrastructure that's kept things together in this moment. It's been digital. And one of the things we realize about digital, by the way, particularly when you look at low-income communities, is that you suddenly realize that while everybody may have a smartphone, if you're going to try to get kids to learn remotely, but they don't have the devices at home, they don't have good Wi-Fi at home, and they've been used to getting that either at their school or in a cafe, and they don't have that. So these digital, we're doing some work in California right now. I'm on the governor's task force, and there's a look at the digital divide. We're starting to realize it's actually wider than we thought it was before this moment. We might have thought we had closed the digital divide because everybody had a smartphone, but if you're having to work from home, you're having to learn from home, you see much wider chasms in digital access.
Interesting. Well, I suspect that's going to be a huge theme for the next year or two. But we're getting some great questions here. I'm going to jump in one straight away, very different, which is, what is your take on China? That comes from James Lee. Mohamed, do you have any views on that?
So on the surface, China is recovering economically much better than virtually anywhere else. And if you look at the IMF projection that came out yesterday, you see China and what surrounds China as really the outlier in a positive sense. But I wonder about certain things. First, I think that we are entering an era of deglobalization, because unlike the first two shocks of globalization in the last 10 years, this one is much more comprehensive. The first one was in 2010. It was really led by the household sector. It was triggered by sense of marginalization, alienation, and the answer was, let's look for inclusive capitalism, inclusive globalization. The second shock to globalization was in 2017-18 with the trade wars. That was government-led. This one is going to be led by companies, that some of which are reshoring, localizing supply chains, by governments. The blame game has just started, and the trade war has just started. And it's going to be led also by households, because I don't think US unemployment is going to come back down quickly. So China will find out pretty quickly that it can no longer use the global economy as a tailwind, that the global economy will be a headwind. The delta is going to be quite severe for it, which means that they have to accelerate reforms. Reforms are painful in the short term. So I think that we are looking at a major test for China going forward, where they have to evolve their growth model much quicker than they have in the past. And it's yet to be seen, because they are in the toughest phase of development, and that is the middle income phase. Only 5 countries have made it in the last 50 years, and none have been as complex as China. So this is going to be a very interesting process. For the sake of the global economy, you hope it goes well. But if you are at the Olympics, suddenly the degree of difficulty has gone up significantly.
James, would you share those comments about China?
I would, and also add the complexity of scale. It's hard to tackle the kinds of issues that Mohamed's describing at scale. And I think China's probably going to discover that, in fact, as value chains and global value chains have evolved to being much more local and regional, I think you're going to see, for example, economies like the United States and even Western Europe rapidly accelerate their own manufacturing sectors. I think, those countries like the United States in some ways had ceded leadership in manufacturing to China. I think at this moment where you starting to see supply chains shortening, and you're starting to see the emergence of very strategic sectors, either as the medical products, medical equipment, or even technology and other arenas that are now foundationally strategic. I think you're going to see the resurgence of the United States and other countries start to want to retake leadership in those arenas. I think that'll change the global competition quite a bit. You only have to look at what's happening with artificial intelligence technology and research, whether it's the biotech industry or even connectivity, 5G. I think you're seeing a renewed focus, actually, in some ways, in what might be been thought of before as kind of classic industrial policy, but at least where you see more effort by Western governments and the private sector in those countries to reignite leadership in all those arenas. I think that'll change the global game quite a bit.
So the kind of deglobalization that Mohamed talks about is going to really create more serious industrial rivalry.
I think certainly industrial rivalry and competition for sure. For sure. The one thing that's been kind of interesting, by the way, on the deglobalization front, and I agree with Mohamed, the one outlier in that front is if you consider globalization to be the flow of things of economic value across countries, the one exception that is continued to accelerate are global data flows, actually. So if you say the flow of goods is slowing down, the flow of commodities is slowing down between countries, cross-border data flows are the one outlier that continues to grow spectacularly.
Interesting. Well, I'm going to go from the global to the local, but also combine two questions, which is this, from Danila Hoopers. Do you have any suggestions on how local governments use their tools to help train and build a community in a more sustainable way based on the community structure in terms of the rural and city issues? And the other question, which I think is kind of linked to this, is a point from Gary Lansman saying, at this point in the conversation, the emphasis has been on companies, not on the segments of the population that have been disadvantaged. And he'd like to hear Mohamed and James discuss the following attributes of these population segments to do with family structure, education, et cetera, et cetera. So what does this mean on people on the ground, and what can governments do actually to try and deal with this on a local basis? James, given your experience in California recently, do you want to comment on this?
Yes, I mean, I think this is a very, very, very important question because, as we talked about before, the local variations in a country like the United States are just mind-boggling. When you look at, county by county, what are the differences? And you suddenly realize that there's some counties where a lot of the foundational locations where the foundational issues are primarily about education and access to education. If we're going to try to create talent pools and in these local communities where people have education, access to education, that's actually quite foundational. The other thing you find locally in some communities is the fact that many businesses have not made we've not made investments in those places. So the differences in terms of where business investment flows varies a lot from place to place. So the silver lining, perhaps as it is in this moment, is that at a time when in fact we're realizing that cities are expensive to live in, that in fact we may not want as much high density as we've had in cities, this might actually be to the benefit of local communities that can now take advantage of the fact that it might be possible to grow investment in local communities, that in fact, if we did have concerted effort towards education and training in local communities, I mean, we've made this a central aspect of the work we're doing in California as part of the governor's task force, which is to actually make inequities a central addressing inequities a central feature of the recovery work we're doing, where the inequities are defined by people and place. So we know that in California, if you're in the Inland Empire, that's very different than being in the Bay Area. So there's a concerted effort to look at these local community issues. But I think investment is part of it, both from the state itself or the government, but also from the private sector, encouraging investment in these local communities.
Mohamed, do you have a view about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think of everything that James just said, and I completely agree with. And it's an area that I've looked at and I care about a lot. as really coming down to a lack of the three attributes you'd want in this world. And this is true whether you're a company, a government, but it's especially true if you're a household. You need resilience. You need the ability to manage through a loss of job, a shock of some sort, your kid needing suddenly Wi-Fi and a better computer. You need optionality because jobs may not come back. And you need the ability to have access to different streams of income. And then you need agility. You need people, the confidence to move, and most importantly, people's willingness to embrace your move. When you look at these three things, it ultimately comes down to, first and foremost, safety nets. Our safety nets are very weak. I shared with Jillian previously the example here. I've been involved with the food bank, and what they tell me, the most striking characteristics of their demand is from people who they had never seen before. They gave me the example of a baggage handler at the local airport who had a great job and had job security. Who would have imagined that volume at the airport would drop by 95%? And that person had never saved and had absolutely no resilience at all. So it is about safety nets. It's about investing in people. It's about investing in communities, as James said. And it's also, and we should be very frank about this, it's about investing in actions that counter both conscious and unconscious biases. Because a lot of times the problem is not the ability to supply a skill set, it's the willingness to receive that skill set.
We have a question here, several questions about, what would happen if Biden took charge in January. And one of the questions I have is, what can he focus on given the challenges he will face? What should be his priorities? I have another question on what should he do about education, given that, education has been such a contentious issue with the educational unions and things. I don't know if you want to jump in with some advice for Biden if he were to win?
Well, I think, regardless of who wins the election, I think the agenda is relatively clear for the country. Clearly, a huge focus on education, particularly with regards to access for education for everybody, I think is foundational. At a time when, one of the things, as you know, Gillian, I've spent a lot of time looking at these questions around the future of work. And one thing that comes out quite clearly in all the research that we and many others have done is that we're going to need to step up dramatically what we do about education. And so, whether it's Biden or President Trump, whoever wins the election is going to have to focus on that in a fundamental way. The other issue is to tackle these inequality issues head on. I just can't imagine how we continue as a country without addressing those. And I think these questions that Mohamed is raising about safety nets, the fact that people's safety nets right now are typically tied to employment, whether it's healthcare or any of those safety nets. Well, this COVID moment has exposed that way of dealing with safety nets is not a very resilient one, because when work goes away, those safety nets go away too. So this idea of really rethinking, how do we think about our benefit system and how portable it is and how we make sure everybody has access to it in a resilient way is clearly a foundational issue. I would also argue tackling climate change. I mean, one of the things that we forget is that climate change is actually an economic issue, and it's a livelihood issue for people because very soon it's going to impact work, it's going to impact people's assets, it's going to impact where people live, and so unless we make progress on that, that has to be on the agenda. So I think we have these quite foundational issues that should be on any leader's agenda going forward, and we just have to tackle them.
Mohamed, any thoughts on that?
So I totally agree with him, and I'm going to add to it, which also will show you the importance of political leadership. So everything that James just said is absolutely crucial. But there will be a tendency to say, okay, but it's not as urgent as relief. It's not as urgent as making sure, because by January, we will not have emerged from the phase of living with COVID, of making sure that we can live with COVID in a better way. So whoever comes in will have, in my mind, three challenges that they have to get buy-in from. One is continue with relief, but make it much more targeted, much more effective, and much more pro-work. The second is continue with the living with COVID to make sure that we have the testing, we have the tracing, we have what we need to give people confidence to engage. You know, there are three segments of the population right now. There is the segment that is not willing and should not engage in economic activity. They're ill, they are vulnerable. There's another segment that are either immune or live in a bubble that where they have immunity because of the bubble they live in. And then the big middle is people that are able to engage but not willing to engage because they don't have trust in the system. There's an information failure there. And this is where policy has to address and reduce that. So it's moving on all three: relief, living better with COVID, and making sure that we do what's needed. Education is critical, so is infrastructure, so is labor retooling, so are safety nets. And I think this is not an engineering problem. This is a political implementation problem. This is a leadership problem.
Yeah, if I could add one other observation, Mohamed. So I agree with that, but I'd add a fourth segment in society that's also, but it fits into the solutions you're suggesting of political leadership. It's the segment of people who they can't work remotely because of the nature of what they do. They actually have to go out there. They probably don't have the economic safety nets that we're talking about. So they end up exposing themselves both to the public health crisis because they need a livelihood. And we're seeing that. And often that group of people are disproportionately Black and brown people who are having to go out there. And no surprise that some of the infection rates are highest in those communities and highest in low-income workers. And many of them are performing many of the essential tasks that we all now agree are essential tasks. So that's another group I think that's important to think about as we're probably going to be living in this situation for a little bit longer than we would like. But that seems to be the reality of where we're going, particularly, as you said at the beginning, Mohamed, with these stop-starts, kind of bouncing around reopening of the economy that we're doing in a somewhat uncoordinated fashion across the different states, at least in the United States. That group of, that fourth segment I'm talking about is actually a substantial part of society, and we should think about how to support that group.
I totally agree, and let me give an international dimension to that, because I'll never forget, I was on a call organized by one of the multilateral institutions that in April, that was asking the question of what happens next. And at that stage, developing countries hadn't been hit at all. They were dealing with the spillovers. And we had an African colleague who had called in from Africa. And she was listening to all this conversation. And she said, you have to realize that if we get hit with a major outbreak, our choice is going to come down to, do we die from infection or do we die from hunger? And I think that that's the extreme of that fourth group, that you have no choice but to engage, but often you cannot protect yourself properly from the health risk.
Which leads me to one last very quick question, which is of the moment. The COVID pandemic and lasting social turmoil has contributed to the resurgence of interest in federal reparations to be paid descendants of slaves. What is the likely impact of a reparations program on the US economy? And we just have a few minutes, but I'm just curious because this is so much a question of the moment. And I'd say it's a question that's keeping us all up at night in New York, quite literally, with all the protests.
Well, I think in many respects, the protests are the combination of decades, if not centuries, of persistent inequality, most of which has had a racial aspect to it in our society. And it's not just an issue of policing, but also just social and economic inequities. And so I think, what I like about the reparations conversation is that it forces kind of a grappling with that history. And it forces a conversation about that history. As an economic question, I'm not sure, to what extent it actually would fundamentally change anything. So, I don't know how big will that number be? How big does that number need to be? I don't know. But I like the fact that it does force a conversation about what we ought to do. Similar to the way I like the debate that we were all having about universal basic income. I don't have a strong view as whether that's the best way to solve inequality, but it forces us to grapple with the question of what do we do with the fact that people don't earn enough to live in this society. So I like the debate that it fosters, but will it solve the issues of inequality? I'm less sure about that.
And of course, by the way, issues or ideas that were considered to be completely beyond the pale and unimaginable just 3 or 4 years ago, as UBI shows, have actually become suddenly more mainstream. But Mohamed, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I completely agree with what James said. And I think that is part of my optimism, is that by asking these really difficult questions and by having conversations about them, I can tell you at home we have them now, we wouldn't have had them 6 months ago. You can get closer to the Sputnik moment that I was referred to earlier. And just on things that were unthinkable, forget 4 years ago, 4 months ago, modern monetary theory. That was unthinkable 4 months ago. We've stumbled into a lot of what modern monetary theory wants to do. Okay, so it's amazing how things can change.
Absolutely. Well, to be a bit controversial, Lenin once said that sometimes nothing happens for decades and sometimes decades happen for weeks. And whatever your political persuasion, I think that's quite a good way of capturing what's been happening in recent months. And as you just heard, what's been happening is not just a cyclical shock. It's actually revealing and intensifying a lot of very profound structural trends, whether it's in terms of digitization, inequality, a rising role of government, a new sense of localization or deglobalization. All of these have come to the fore in a way that's going to be creating a lot of challenges. In the last couple of minutes, I'd like to end on a positive note. Can you name one thing briefly that gives you reason for hope or optimism as we sign off? Mohamed.
I can name more than one because I have a list on my desk. But if you want me to name one, I would say the leapfrogging in medical invention and innovation that's going on, that's going to save millions and millions of lives. There's a lot of positive externality to the amount of interaction we're seeing among scientists in the medical community. And that is going to save millions and hundreds of millions of lives around the world that go well beyond COVID.
James, cheer us up.
I love the fact that we rediscovered the importance of science and facts and data, that it actually really matters in this moment. I love the fact that it's been quite remarkable to see how people can move quickly and act quickly when they choose to. Organizations who might have taken months and years to make big decisions made them in a few days. And we're quite surprised that they could actually make positive change happen very quickly. So those two things give me reason for optimism.
Well, that's great. Well, I'll add to that. One of the silver linings for me has been the chance I get to hang out with brilliant brains like yourselves and talk about these issues without getting jet lag, without having to travel, and having a chance to just chat to you about what's going on. It's been a terrific conversation, guys. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you to the audience for all the great questions, and for all of you who are trying to figure out where we've come from in the last few shocking months, where we're going, and how we can each try to build the planet slightly better than it was before. Thank you for listening and watching, and best of luck. Thank you.
Thank you.